Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you're having a restful Shabbat. I hope that you're enjoying time with family and also making sure to, of course, above all, spend time with God and in His Word. And saying that, we're going to go ahead and actually get into the Word today. So this is Parashah 3, which is Lech Lecha, which in English means get yourself out. most of the parashahs are named after the first couple words or so um, in the start of the portion. Sometimes they're not, but usually they are. So that's a kind of explanation for how the parashahs get their titles. All right, so let's go ahead and get into um, the portion for today. So this portion starts in chapter 12 of Genesis. And so we start out with Abraham receiving the calling from God. So if you remember, prior to this parashah, the past parashah, um, Abram right now, was in Haran, which was up in what's present day Syria. So he has not made it into Canaan yet. All of his family, all those from Terah, his father, they were all supposed to um, go to Canaan, but they stopped in Haran, and my guess is because Terah got old and he just couldn't make the journey anymore, and so they stopped in Haran. But God calls him on further, and I believe there was a reason for this. It talks about later that God was the one who called him out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So it could be that God was the one who started this whole motion, like through Abram to begin with. Maybe Abram said, "Hey, I got this vision," or whatever it happened to be. That God said we need to go ahead and move on. And then eventually Terah and those thought it was a good idea, and the whole family moved. They were planning to go to Canaan. However, God's plan the whole time was for only Abram's family to actually go down to Canaan. And so it works out to where Terah and the rest of the relatives stay in Haran, where Abraham actually ends up going actually down into Canaan. Okay, so God starts off telling Abram his desire, his heart's desire, to make Abram to a great nation, to make Abram's name so great that he may be a blessing to others. And in fact, in Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. There is a lot to unpack there. So obviously, Abram had gotten God's favor. Now, this was done because he obeyed God and because he was chased. He was, worshipped and had a relationship with God with all his heart. It was not because Abraham was perfect. It was not really because Abraham earned anything. But the fact that he actually stayed close to God despite his shortcomings, that is what where it's because why God actually gave him his favor. He did not earn anything. No one earns anything from God. I know that especially in Tanakh, it makes it seem that way. God blesses based on our decisions. However, remember that we are imperfect. So in reality, our constant imperfections are working against all that we do that is good. And so reality, we don't earn anything. God gives it to us, and he gives it to us based on the fact that he loves us, and also on the fact that when we do make good decisions that result in a blessing. Okay? So I don't want you to think that, anybody earns anything, because in reality, the only thing any of us have earned is death, because we are not perfect, because we do not follow God perfectly. And I know that seems harsh and unfair, that God is cruel. He is not cruel. He is just. He is perfect. And so he wants, remember in Leviticus, he said, "Be holy as I am holy." In other words, you were to be perfect as I am perfect. Well, none of us are capable of doing that. There was only one person that ever was capable of doing that, and that was Yeshua, Jesus. Okay? And that's why he was able to go ahead and offer himself as a sacrifice for our sins. Outside of that, none of us, the Psalms say it themselves, not one of us is good. So even Abraham, so none of us have earned anything from God. It is given to us by grace. Okay. So he's going to make Abram into a great nation. He is going to make his name so great that he may be a blessing. Now, understand this here. He's not just making Abram's name great so he can make Abraham's name great. There is a purpose behind it, and the purpose behind it is that he may be a blessing. And not just a general blessing, but as you see in the third bullet point there, so that Abram and all the families of the earth be blessed in Abraham. So it's not just a blessing for Abraham. It's not just a blessing for his family or his descendants. It's also ultimately to be a blessing to all the families of the earth may be blessed. So God's whole purpose here with Abraham from the beginning is global. It's not just Jewish people. Okay? Because, again, in God's eyes, all people are people. The difference is that God gave Abraham a covenant and later gave the Jewish people a covenant so that through them, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well, how is that going to happen? That's going to happen in two ways. The first way is through them spreading truth wherever they go. Okay? The second way is through Mashiach, or Messiah Yeshua, Jesus. Okay, those are the two ways that God uses Abraham to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Okay, the spreading of truth and for all to be saved through Messiah Yeshua. That is the ultimate blessing. Okay. Now, God also promises to bless them that bless him and to curse them that curse them. Now, why is that? Well, it is out of God's love for Abram. Okay, because Abram kept himself close to God, he blesses those who bless him and curses who curse him. Now, this blessing and cursing is not just to Abraham; it's also to any of God's people. Okay, any of the people who stay close to God, God is going to bless them and bless those that bless them. So if you look at later on Lot was with Abraham. He blessed Abram through his relationship and service and things of that nature. And so through that, Lot was blessed. Now, anybody who curses Abram, God promises to curse, because God does not take kindly to people come against his people. Okay? Okay. So we see here that after that, Abraham went exactly where God told him to. Again, we're bringing up the emphasis of obedience. Okay? We have to be obedient. If we're not obedient, then all bets are off. Okay? So Lot also went with him. So it's kind of odd. So out of all of the family members, or the family of Terah, only Lot went with Abraham. Okay, now we can make kind of some, we can kind of do some things from that. Maybe Abraham saw that, or maybe Lot saw that Abraham's God was the true God. Maybe he saw that Abraham was blessed and wanted to go with him wherever he went. There's several reasons you can see behind that. Now we see that Abraham starts his journey when he's 75 years old. Okay, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I'm going to plan on walking for, hundreds of miles when I'm 75 years old. So that tells you the vigor of Abraham, and I think generally of people back then, before they became more sedentary like we are nowadays. Now, Abraham was already blessed in Haran. It says that he had possessions and people, and so he was already blessed in Haran. So, if from the world's perspective, there was no reason for him to have to move on. He was already doing quite well where he was at. However, he went ahead and left everything, took everything he had, left everything behind, and went where God told him. Okay, he was completely sold out to God. He was going to do whatever God told him. All right. Now we see throughout the narrative, this parashah of Abraham going from place to place to place, and although they were 20, 30, 40 miles apart from where he went from place to place, every point was relatively close because the whole size of Canaan is only about the size of New Jersey. It's not a very large parcel of land. And so everything was relatively close. And I think God had that on purpose. He wanted it to be spread enough where people had room, but he wanted cities and places to be close enough to where people felt a sense of community. So there was a reason behind the size and how things were set up inside of Canaan. So Abraham builds an altar, the very first altar in Shechem, and altars were a type of memorial back then. They weren't always associated with sacrifice. They could be, but they weren't always associated with sacrifice. Often it was for them. It was a point of reference. It was a point of memorial. It was a object of faith, like an object lesson or a point of object to faith. And so it was a lot of different purposes it served. And you'll notice as we go later on that Abraham always returned to these places where his altar was at. And the whole point was it was an act of worship. It was an act of strengthening faith. There's a lot, because there's a lot involved in that. And you'll see that throughout this narrative of Abraham. Okay. So from there, he moved on to Bethel and built an altar there also. And he also kept moving southward. So as you can see, almost everywhere that Abraham went, he built an altar and then moved on. Okay. In other words, just a place to worship. Every single place, everywhere he went, he built that altar as a place to worship. And so, again, it was a sign of Abraham's deep faith, his commitment to God. Now, as he keeps moving down southward, God promises the land of Canaan to Abram's seed. Okay, so he brought Abram down to go ahead and give the land of Canaan to Abram's seed. Okay, and as we see again, God's purposes aren't as simple as sometimes we make them out to be. Yes, he's giving the land of Canaan to Abram and his seed, or to Abram's seed, but there's a purpose behind that. Okay, there's a reason why. It's not a thing where, again, they've earned something. Okay, it's first of all a covenant. So God covenanted and said, "Hey, I'm going to give this seed, this land to your seed," and He says it several times throughout this parashah. But He's also gives it to them so they can, they obviously they can expand and grow and multiply. But again, there's also behind that why. Is it just so they can go ahead and live and multiply? Or is there another reason behind it? And again, we go back to God saying He wanted to bless all the families of the earth through Abraham and his seed. All right. So the reason for their southward journey, as we read at the end of that last part, was because there was a famine currently going on in Canaan. Now that wasn't the first. This won't be the first time this happens. This also happens again in the time of Jacob. Okay, and so we see that it seems that Canaan is prone to famines. Now that may not be because of a climate issue. It may also be because of, remember that God talked about that the land was going to vomit the Canaanites out because of their practices. So this could be the start of that vomiting of the Canaanites out. Okay, so And Egypt does become a place where Israel is preserved at least twice. So whenever this famine happens, Israel, the people of Israel go down to, first of all, it's Abram, but then later on it becomes Jacob's children that goes down to Israel or to Egypt to actually go ahead and buy food and to basically be preserved by Egypt. And this is basically an example of God can use the world at times to bless his people. We a lot of times we view the world as need to be separate, they're wicked, and all this kind of stuff. But God does use the world to bless his people. He can go ahead and transfer the riches of the world to his people. We see that whenever Israel comes out of Egypt after their enslavement, that they are basically the world of Egypt at the time heaps blessings upon the Israelites as they go forth. Now, as Abram enters into Egypt, he tells Sarai, "Please don't let them know you're my wife. Just tell them you're my sister, because if they find out you're my wife, they're going to kill me and take you for themselves." Okay, that's an act of fear. Abraham's not is human, just like everybody else. He has fears, he has setbacks, he has all kind of things that just like we do. His difference between him and us, or him and the rest of humanity at the time, was his closeness to God. Okay, not his perfectness, but his closeness to God. And so this fear would unfortunately get him in trouble a few times, as we'll see through the rest of Parashah. Okay, so as a result of this little deception, God still turned it around to bless Abraham, or bless Abram and Sarai. Okay, now the dangerous part of this, and God does deal with Abram about this, is that, excuse me, is that the Egyptians, all the Egyptians associated with this, almost lost their lives. God was bringing plagues and all kind of things upon the Egyptians because Pharaoh had brought Sarai into his house, in other words, to make her his wife, because he thought that she was Abram's sister. Okay, and so now technically Abraham did not lie about that. I'm not going to get into that because of the interrelationships between Terah and his household. Technically, Sarah could have been considered Abram's sister, but regardless, it was still deceptive. Okay, so now the Egyptians weren't without guilt. Okay, the Egyptians were very fluid, which is, they liked somebody, they went ahead and did whatever with them. They didn't think anything about it. There was no, they were polygamists, which they had multiple wives. They went ahead and had sexual relations with anybody they wanted, whenever. They didn't think about it. To them, this wasn't a big deal. And so the only thing they respected was that you didn't do it against somebody else's wife. That's the only thing that they respected. And so Pharaoh became quite angry when that point of morality was crossed, where he almost, had relations with Sarai, and it was Abraham's wife. And so even the Egyptians realized that wasn't good to do. We just don't do that. And so he was very angry with Abram over this, and said, "Hey, you could have cost my people their lives because of this little deception." And so God did use Pharaoh as a point of chastisement for Abram and his fear. God didn't have to do it himself. He let Pharaoh do it. And Pharaoh was quite poignant in saying, your fear, your little deception here almost cost people their lives. And so, again, we see that Abraham was not perfect. He was prone to fear. And that's a common thing for a lot of people. We're not gonna sit there and come down on people. When we read throughout the Bible and read throughout different narratives, sometimes, yes, people, you're like, man, this guy was really wicked. But other times they're just struggling, like Abram and like others, where they're struggling with their own humanity, and they're counting on God to help them change. And God is, if you can see between the lines here, God is trying to help Abram change and get past um, this fear motivator. All right. So after that, Abram was essentially evicted from Egypt forcibly. Pharaoh wasn't playing around. He didn't want anything to do more with this. He said, please take all you have and your wife and just go. And so Abraham went. Okay. Now this must have been towards either the end of the famine or that they had enough food and things gathered from Egypt to go ahead and survive during the famine. Okay. So Abram and Sarai, they went ahead and returned to the Negev, which is the far southern part of Israel. And then they moved on by stages back to Bethel, or back to the place where they originally were, where that altar was, just east of Bethel. Okay, so they went down to Egypt to survive, and then they're returning back to where they were, either because the famine's over or because they have enough to go ahead and survive on from their time down in Egypt. Again, the altar is built. The altar he built is mentioned explicitly again. So why? Why does this mention of altar keep reappearing throughout this narrative? It's reinforcement of the fact that Abraham always returns to important places where he can remember what God did for them. He also returns to a place where there's altars so he can worship. It's all centered around his relationship with God. So this altar keeps being put out front to emphasize that relationship. All right. So we haven't read about it, but Lot has been there the whole time. we read about Abram. We read about Sarai. We read about different things, but we have not heard anything about Lot. But he's been there with his belongings as well, and his people. And so Abram and Lot have been so blessed that there were so many possessions they had, they couldn't be with each other anymore. They were fighting over space. There just wasn't enough space. Now Lot was blessed because, like I said earlier, because of being with Abram, and also because of his own righteousness. You'll see that later in a future Parashah with the Sodom and Gomorrah account. Okay, so when they separated, Lot had to make a decision. Where am I going to go? Now, I can imagine in Lot's mind, he knew of the covenant with Abraham. And so he knew that anywhere west of there, north of there, south of there, was going to end up being Abram's land. Okay? And so that, along with what he saw in the Jordan Valley, how it was well watered and it was suitable for his livestock, he went ahead and chose the Jordan Valley. Now, this was not because Lot was wicked. It was not because Lot was worldly or he didn't care. He simply went where he thought he would be supported. He probably didn't even have any idea of how bad those cities were. Okay, he could have been not kind of naive that way, or just didn't have the knowledge. So, thinking that there was some lack of morals of why he did that, that's not right. Okay, obviously Abraham stayed put because that was the land that was going to be given to him. Okay, and at this point, God reiterates and says, "Hey, again, I'm promising you and your descendants this land grant, this land. Okay, it's a part of the covenant. Okay." He also again expands on this, and he doesn't just promise the land to him, but also that his seed will be the numerous as the dust of the earth, like just beyond count. Okay. Now I find that kind of interesting because in the Bible, Israel's called small. Okay, so it's kind of interesting because God said, "Go multiply the sea as the dust of the earth," but at the same time, Abraham or Israel's called a small nation, so it kind of contradicts. And to me, it kind of speaks to the fact that God knew that the exile was going to happen and that they would continue to multiply and spread over the face of the earth. As bad as the exile was, God knew it was going to happen. And so, in reality, even though Israel was small as far as a plot of land, or maybe even originally as a people, eventually they would grow, regardless of how that happened, as the dust of the earth. Even with all the mass murders of the people through exile, through all the pogroms um, of the Europeans, the Nazis, all of that, even through all of that, Abraham's seed has become numerous as the dust of the earth overall. Okay, so then God, after making the promise, God commands him to go ahead and walk the entire length and breadth of it. Why? Why do that? He made the promise. That should be good enough. Why have him to walk? So, in Oklahoma here, we have something what's called the land run. Okay, and so when the land run happened, you got the land that you placed your foot on. So when you went ahead and you staked out that land, that was yours, but you had to go there physically and occupy it. So here, it's kind of the same thing. God wanted him to walk up the length and breadth of it, to not just see it all, but to um, place his feet on it all as a representation of him claiming it all. Okay. All right. So Abraham, again, as you've seen multiple times throughout this, moves from place to place, and he ends up further south down in Hebron. And from there on out, throughout the rest of this narrative, that's where he stays. So he ends up in Hebron, and where he dwells by the trees of an Amorite named Mamre. Okay, and you're going to see Mamre pop up again here soon. Now, the Amorites were part of the peoples that were going to be destroyed and kicked out of the land. But at this point, it almost seems like Abram at least had a friendly relationship with Mamre. Now, I want you to point out here that just because Mamre was an Amorite does not mean necessarily that Mamre was a bad man or his brothers were bad men, that we'll talk about later. Okay, remember the harlot in Jericho, and there's others that have actually been kind to the Israel people, and actually were a lot of them were actually became Israelites and themselves. So again, being called an Amorite doesn't necessarily mean that they were like the rest of their people. Now, we get to a point where Lot's in Sodom and with his family and all his possessions, and now all of a sudden the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah start to rebel against the kings of Elam. Elam was actually Persia and was as a present day Iran. So they don't want to serve those kings anymore, and so the kings of Elam decide to go ahead and force the issue. So they go ahead and march westward. And as they do so, they ransack and destroy and capture and take control of everything along the way. And eventually, they reach the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other part of the 5 cities with their kings. And so the king of Sodom and Gomorrah set up against them. They go to battle, and in that part, at least during that time, there were tar pits across that area. And so during the battle, some of those kings, some of the people of the Sodom and Gomorrah went ahead and actually were either caught or swallowed up by those tar pits. And so, with that happening, the rest of them retreat. Um, I guess I was seeing westward because they eventually go to Abram, so they retreat westward. Okay, well that leaves their cities opened up where the kings of Elam can just go in, take all the people, all the possessions, and start to take them back with them towards Elam, including Lot, his family, and all he has. Okay. So a survivor comes and tells Abram about what had happened and the kidnapping of Lot. Now, how did the survivor know about Abram? Did they know Lot? Did Lot tell them a lot about Abram? How about Abram was a great guy and a great uncle and took care of him? And I mean, we don't know what Lot said, but somehow this survivor knew about Abram. Now, it could very well have been one of Lot's people. If it was, then it makes sense of how he knew to go say, hey, I'll go tell Abram. He'll know what to do. And Abraham went ahead and would go ahead and save the day, as we're going to read on here in just a minute. But if it wasn't, then maybe, whoever it was, it just happened to hear about Abram from Lot. Okay, so Abram at this point again, rounds up 318, but basically all of his trained men to go to battle against the kings of Elam, all right, along with Mamre and his brothers Eshcol and Aner. So all of them go out to fight the king of Elam. Now, even with Abram's allies, they probably still were vastly outnumbered by the kings of Elam and their armies. Okay, so that took a lot of faith and a lot of determination. So Abram, again, he was a man of action. He was a man, he showed fear in certain aspects, and in other aspects, he was ready to go. It's part of being human. He had times when he was fearless, yet there were times when he had fear. And in this instance, he trusted God and he was fearless and went over to go and do what he had to do to save Lot, his nephew, and his people. And at the same time, not just Lot and his nephew, he ended up saving all the people and all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rest of the 5 cities. And not only did Abram fight them, he could have fallen to a point where they retreated and went back. No, that's not what Abram did. He chased them all the way up the length of Canaan, all the way up to Damascus, to make sure that every single last one of them was dead. He didn't leave not one of them left. So whenever Abram did something, he did it fully. He didn't do it halfway. And it speaks to his obedience, total obedience. It really goes in contrast to, again, like King Saul, who did things half measures and ended up being rejected. Abraham did things fully. Okay. Now, upon his return down south from Damascus, he comes close to a city called Salem. Now, we know by the way where it's positioned and by how it's described that this must have been Jerusalem. Okay. So Melchizedek, or Melchizedek as we call it, was not only its king, but he was also a priest of El Elyon. He was priest of the same God that Abram worshipped. Okay, so now we see a little bit here that it's not just Abram that worships the true God. There are others out there also. Melchizedek blesses Abram, as the priests do. If you remember the priestly blessing from Aaron to the people of Israel, they have a kind of same thing going on here where Melchizedek blesses Abram, and as a result, Abraham gives him a tenth of everything. Okay, so of all the riches, everything that was there, he gave him a tenth of everything. Okay, now this again, giving him a tenth of everything does not mean that Abraham was going to keep it for himself to begin with. He just gives him a tenth. And we'll read about that later on. So tithes are interesting. Tithes are actually kind of tribute. Okay, when you are under someone, especially back in those days, if you're a king under a higher up king, like a king of kings, you pay tribute. That's kind of what was going on with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were paying tribute. They were giving, they were following the orders and paying tribute of the kings of Elam. Okay, and then one day they decide, no, we're not going to do this anymore. So Abram here is kind of giving tribute to Melchizedek. Now you only do that again when there's someone higher than you. You pay tithes. You pay tribute to someone who is in a higher position than you are. So in that way, Abram was basically giving to Melchizedek a tribute and a tithe. Now, tithes also are taken by God. We'll read later on the Torah that God commands tithes to be given. But to God, they're acts of worship. They're acts of tribute. However, he doesn't keep those things for himself. He doesn't have need of them. He does probably what Melchizedek did, was to go ahead and give his resources to those in need. Okay, to give them to other priests, to give them to the poor and the needy, the widows. Okay, and so again, tithes are given as tribute. Now the worldly will go ahead and just take those tithes and use them on themselves. That is not how God uses them, and it's not how God's people use them. They are used to help others. Okay. Okay. So the king of Sodom offered Abram everything. He only wanted his people back. Hey, this is all your spoils. Just give me the people back, and you can have everything else as spoils of war. And that was common back then. Throughout the Tanakh, you'll read about the spoils of war. Whenever they won, winner take all. Okay. However, Abraham knew the king of Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew what these people were all about. He knew how wicked they were. He knew how wicked the king of Sodom was. And he didn't want the king of Sodom to be able to say anything about helping Abram. Okay? He didn't want to take any glory away from God, and he didn't want to give any glory to the king of Sodom. So he refused to take anything from him because he did not want his success to be attributed in any way to the king of Sodom, who was wicked to boot. All right. So let's talk about Melchizedek for another minute. So in Psalm 110:4, it talks about the Messiah Yeshua. Okay, it's a messianic portion of the psalm, and it talks about that you will be after the order of Melchizedek forever, a priest forever. Okay, so that is interesting because Messiah comes out of Yehuda or Judah. Well, Judah is not a priestly tribe. Levi was. Okay, so the question then becomes, are there two orders of priests? Is there a Levitical priesthood and Melchizedek priesthood? It seems so. It seems that Messiah will be part of a priesthood that is actually of a higher order than the priests of Levi. And for us as believers who, now let's roll back again for a minute. So God eventually calls Israel a nation of kings and priests. The whole point of it was for them to be kings and priests. Now, Levi is eventually given the priesthood because of what happened at the golden calf incident, and also because of you had the firstborn who were traditionally the priests of their families that were offering sacrifices here, there, and everywhere and doing things. There was no order to it. Okay, so God established order through Levi to actually be the one who is honored to be the priest because of their zeal during the golden calf incident. But if you notice that every firstborn has to be paid for, has to be made, because every firstborn, whether it's a person or an animal, is God's. Even the first of everything else. Your tithes, your first fruits are God's. So the first of everything is God's. Okay. So, anyways, Levi takes that part, but originally, what the original plan was for all of Israel to be a nation of kings and priests, and to kind of be like the order of Melchizedek. Okay, but we see here that Melchizedek is definitely a higher order. It is the order of priests that Yeshua himself is part of as Messiah. He still serves as high priest today in the heavenly place in heaven until he returns. And so, and we ourselves are also considered kings and priests who follow him. It is exactly what God wanted Israel to be. We are grafted into Israel, and so we, like Israel, are also a nation of kings and priests. Okay, so now this is what happened with Abram. Now, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, they weren't part of the covenant God made with Abram. So they were able to go ahead and take the spoils they wanted. Okay, Abram said, hey, go ahead and give them what's theirs, but I don't want any of it. Okay. All right. So, we're now down on chapter 15. So, as we begin chapter 15, God comes to Abraham and envisions him not to fear. Well, what was Abraham worried about? Abraham's fear is brought up again. So again, just like all of us, Abraham has times when he's fearful, has times when he's not fearful, when he's bold. And so this time, Abraham's worried about something. Okay, and so God makes a point of coming and saying, "Hey, don't fear. I'm your shield. I'm your reward. Everything you need is all wrapped up in me. Don't fear." And we read after that the reason why Abram was worried was because he was worried about not having an heir. I mean, he was in his 90s. He was old and he could not see what was going to happen. So he was trying to plan in his head. And you can see later that he tells God, "All I have is my servant in my house. The chief servant in my house is going to be my heir because I have nobody else to pass along things to." And so he's worried he's going to have to give his servant to be an heir of his house because he's got no other way, and he doesn't understand how God's going to fulfill his promise with him and Sarai being as old as they are and having no heir. And so God promises, God says, "Hey, your servant is not going to be the person I use. Someone comes from you yourself, Abram, is going to be the heir, and I will go ahead and make your descendants as a multitude that you cannot count." And this time comparison with the stars in the sky. So again, God is calming Abram down and saying, "Hey, look, don't fear. I'm all you need. I'm going to give you the heir from your own body. It is not going to be how you think it's going to be." Now, the key thing here is, and this is what is explained throughout the Bible about Abram. Abram believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. What was reckoned to him as righteousness? He believed God. Okay, God said something. He believed it. That was it. Okay, there was no second guessing. There was no, I'm going to think about it. It was immediate belief. And it's the same thing that Miriam or Mary did when the angel came to announce that she was pregnant with Yeshua. It's expounded. It's multiple times throughout where people were told something by God and they instantly believed it. Okay, that is having the faith of Abram, and that's the kind of faith that God wants us to have in Him. Is so when He says something, we believe it. We don't doubt it. That's just how it is. Okay. All right. Now, God emphasizes to Abram that He was the same God who brought him out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. In other words, God's emphasizing that, hey, this whole entire thing orchestrated since Ur of the Chaldeans has been my orchestration. Okay? The same one who protected you in Egypt, the same one who protected you from the kings of Elam, the same one who's blessed you. I am the same one who's done all this for you. I am in control. Okay? And so Abram asked, well, how am I supposed to know that I'm going to inherit all this when basically in Abram's mind, nothing is going the way I thought it was going to go? Okay? And so now we get to the cutting of a covenant. Okay, so God commands Abram to go ahead and retrieve 5 different types of animals. Now, Abram lives in a culture where he understands covenants. Now, that's not something you really understand nowadays with our culture. We understand promises and we understand contracts, but covenants were not the same. Okay, and so it was kind of contractual in a way, but it's not quite a contract. And so Abraham went ahead and took the animals, cut them in half, except for the birds, and put them opposite each other where there's a path. So you can imagine there's animal, 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 kind of making a path along in between them. Okay, now something to understand about covenants. When you cut a covenant, the part of it was when you went through those, walked through those pieces, you realized that if you didn't keep your part of the covenant, that's what was going to happen to you. If you didn't keep your part of the covenant, you were going to be cut like those animals were, to the point of destruction. Okay? And so, seeing that, you can see how seriously God and the people back then took covenants. They were nothing to be played around with. Okay, nowadays I break contract, I may have to pay for financial penalty. You may have prison, okay, but nothing physically comes to harm you, okay, and at least in Western culture, okay. However, back then, you broke a covenant, your physical safety was on the line, okay. Your life was bound up in that covenant. If you broke it, you were in danger of forfeiting your life. That's how serious it was, and it still is in God's eyes. Now, the birds of prey try to come down and, just like birds are, try to come down and snip and pick and eat some of the flesh and, have a free meal. And Abraham has to chase them off. Now, there's a reason why that's mentioned there. It's symbolic of the enemy trying to steal God's promises away. Okay? Obviously, if the enemy knows, if Satan and the fallen angels and all those, they know that Messiah is going to come forth from Abram, they're going to try to do whatever they can to stop that. Okay? And so this is kind of a symbol of that, where the enemy is trying to come and immediately steal God's promises away before the covenant can be set between Abram and God. All right, so while this setting is in place, sun starts to set, it gets dark. It's starting to get dark at night. And so Abraham falls in a deep sleep. Okay? Now, the way this is worded, this is not a natural sleep. He's kind of put, I don't want to call it a trance because that sounds kind of cultish or pagan, but he kind of falls into a trance where, and then great darkness comes upon him, kind of like a vision. I guess you could call this kind of a vision. Okay? And so during this time, God tells Abram about the future of it. Now remember, prior to this, Abram asks, how am I to know this is going to happen? This is God explaining how he's going to know. Now, granted, Abraham will not be around when this happens. However, God's telling him this is how you're going to know that it's happened or it's going to happen. So he tells him that Abram's descendants will be enslaved in another nation for 400 years. But when they are done, when they come out, they will be very rich, have much possessions, and blessed. And that nation that enslaves them will be punished. Okay? And so he also promised Abram, you will live a long time, but it's implicit that he will not see the promises fulfilled. Okay? Instead, the fourth generation from Abram, when they will return to where Abraham is and possess the land. Okay, so that's how this is all going to come about. So God basically tells Abram, hey, this is how it's all going to happen. Okay, so why not now? Why doesn't God just keep Abram there and just go ahead and let him take over right there? Okay, there may be a couple reasons for that. The first is the one's kind of obvious here. It's not time yet. God makes it clear that the Amorites, their sinfulness, their iniquity hasn't been full yet. In other words, their amount of wickedness hasn't come to the point yet to where God's ready to evict them from the land. Okay? And so during that time, God's also doing a process in Abraham's descendants, okay, through the enslavement in Egypt. There is a purpose for that. It is not just to cause pain for Abraham's descendants. It is not to um, just haphazard. There's a reason for it. And yes, there's a lot of pain and death that comes through that. But God used that, and we're going to get into that very far along when I get into Exodus or Shemot. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. As we'll see later, there's a definite reason for why God allowed things to happen the way they're happening. It has to do with timing. It has to do with preparation. All that is involved. So after this, God then formally passes through the objects by way of the image of a smoking oven and a torch. Okay, by going through that, those pieces, he signifies the agreeing to and the signing, if you want to call it, of the covenant. Now the covenant is official. Okay. Now, notice that Abraham did not walk through the pieces; only God did. Okay. So this is kind of signifying of God taking both parts, where he is both the one making the covenant and the one who will ultimately, through Yeshua, in our place, suffer as a breaking of the covenant. Okay. However, we'll see later, there is a cutting part for Abraham to play. Okay. It's small, and it won't be as it does deal with Abraham's sins will have consequences of breaking the covenant. However, the way God did it in this prior part signifies that overall, God is the one who's going to end up taking the punishment for Abraham and his descendants for their breaking of the covenant through Yeshua the Messiah. Okay. So God again spells out his part of the covenant with Abraham. All the land from the Nile to the Euphrates and all the land of Canaan will be that of Abraham's. Now, if you think ahead to when the Israelites conquered the land, that is not fully realized. It just the property, whatever Israel takes over, does not extend down the Nile, and it does not extend up to Euphrates, which means that this promise is going to be fulfilled at a future time. So when it is finally finalized, when Messiah returns and puts an end to all this, and when he establishes kingdom, that is when you're going to see that the nation of Israel extend from the Nile to the Euphrates. It will be finally fully realized at that point. Okay, so as you can see, and down further in the bullets, there is 10 years that Abram and Sarai have lived in the land of Canaan. Okay, so they've been waiting this entire time for God to go ahead and give them a child to be the heir. Well, eventually their patience runs out, and Sarah decides to go ahead and take matters into her own hands. This is never, ever, ever a good thing. Whenever God promises or commands something, we take things in our own hands. You can guarantee it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a disaster. Okay? Regardless of our motives, regardless of our understanding, when we take into our hands, we're taking out of His, and we're going to make it into a disaster. And so, unfortunately, Abram agrees and participates in this taking control. Now, why would Abram and Sarah do this? Is it because they doubted God? Well, maybe God's just not going to do it. No, I don't think it was because of that. Because Abram's still called a man of faith. And so I don't think it has anything to do with him believing. So did Abraham just go along with Sarai to appease her? Maybe she was the one that had no faith and he went along to appease. That may have been a portion of it. Maybe he just wanted to go ahead and but that would have been coupled with the next bullet point. Okay, maybe Abraham decided, maybe I need to do something because God didn't specify the child would come from Sarai. Okay, he just said it would come from me. Okay, so maybe coupled with Sarah's impatience, maybe he decided, yeah, we need to go ahead and do this. And so what they do is that Sarai gives Abram her servant Hagar. Okay, now Hagar is an Egyptian, and he most probably acquired her while they were down in Egypt. Okay, and so if you can think about that, Egypt represents the world, and now all of a sudden we have Abraham having a child with Hagar, who represents the world. So he is having a child of the world. Okay, that's never a good thing, because when we mix with the world and we produce something that is a hybrid of the world, it's going to cause problems for us. So when Hagar became pregnant, and we're going to start seeing that right now, she realized the position she was in. Now all of a sudden, she was pregnant with the heir to the promise. That put her above. That put her high. Okay, that put her almost as on par with Sarai. And in her eyes, she could have viewed herself as even better than Sarai. Well, you couldn't have children. Remember back then, if you were barren and couldn't have children, they automatically looked at you as you were either cursed or there was something wrong with you. And even when there was something wrong with you, that you were like that because you were being cursed for something bad you did, or something bad your relatives did, or whatever, or ancestors. And so Sarai was already, had to deal with that. But now, on top of it, Hagar is rubbing it basically in her face. Okay? Now, when this happens, Sarah becomes angry with Abram, basically blames him for the issue. Okay? Now, it could have been that Sarah just wanted to shift the blame for the decision to use Hagar and just make it all Abram's fault. However, when you start seeing like this, the belittlement happen, I don't think it was just a one and done deal. This probably was a behavior that was going on for a little while, and Abram was overlooking it, not taking care of it. Now, realize that Hagar was Sarai's servant. She was assigned to Sarai. So Abraham left all the affairs with Hagar with Sarai. Sarai dealt with it. It wasn't Abram's purview. Okay. However, in Sarai's eyes, if it had been going for a while, she expected Abram to come to her defense and put an end to it, and he did not. So that could be some of the reasoning behind why Sarai was angry. Okay. So at this point, Abram becomes quite annoyed, and he's like, "Look, she's your servant. Just do whatever you want with her." Okay. Now, back then, since that was a servant, it was kind of like property. So you could just do whatever you want with her. Okay? Now, I don't know, I wouldn't call that such a moral failing by Abram necessarily. It could have been partially. But he was annoyed. He was probably a little angry at this point and just wanted Sarai to get out of his hair. So, look, if you don't want her here, she's driving you nuts or whatever's going on, just do whatever you want to do with her. Okay? Um, So, having been given license to do so, Sarai goes ahead and actually starts treating Hagar the same way, very, very meanly, selling her with words, maybe threatening her. I mean, we don't know what all would happen, but obviously it was bad enough to where it caused Hagar to run away. Okay, now imagine this: Hagar is pregnant. Okay, and so she's running. Okay, we don't know how far she went, but in that climate, depending on what time of year it was, if it was hot out, and she's running and fleeing away, and if it took more than one day, now she's gone ahead and she's sleeping out in the cold. So in her condition, and she's running out there fleeing from Sarai, it must have been pretty bad. Okay. So the angel of God comes and intervenes, and he basically asks Hagar, "Where are you going?" Now, obviously, if it's an angel of God, and if it's and as we talk about later, if this is a representative of Yeshua before of Messiah before his coming, um, then he should have already known why, um, where Hagar was going and why. Okay, so why ask the question? Well, let's think back to the beginning of Genesis. Okay, so God asked Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" Well, God knew where they were, right? So why ask the question? Because he wanted them to realize where they were at. Now, that explains it, okay? So the angel Adonai wants Hagar to realize, where are you going? Where are you going to go? There's nowhere to go. Um, why are you're running away from your only place that you have of safety? And so he's trying to get through Hagar's mind to realize, uh, the consequences of what she's doing. Okay. So Hagar explains, and the angel of God tells her to basically to return to humble yourself. In other words, it's almost like the angel of God saying, look, you kind of brought this on yourself with the way you treated Sarai. Now you need to go back and you need to humble yourself under her. Okay, that's the solution to this whole thing, is for you to go back and humble yourself. Be apologetic and humble yourself. Okay? Now, I have not looked it up in the Hebrew, and I should have, but that word return could very well mean be related to teshuva. Now, teshuva is the word for repentance. It's return in the way of repentance. So what the angel of God could have been telling her is, hey, you need to go repent and humble yourself before Sarai. Okay, and that's going to heal the rift. That's going to resolve this and put things right. Now, is it a perfect or permanent solution? No. As you will see later, this whole thing happens again. Okay. All right. So the angel of God also says that he will bless Hagar's descendants where they will be too many to count. Okay. Well, that's interesting because only God blesses like that. Okay. So, and we notice that in other places in the Word, we just hear about angels. But this one is specifically even a title, an angel of God, or the angel of Adonai. Okay? So, that of could be, so we know that there is God represents himself in the Father, the Son Yeshua, and his Spirit. So, this could be a representation of God, a part of God that represents himself as an angel. Okay? So, this he very well was God in the form of an angel blessing, would bless Hagar's descendants. Okay? All right. So, the angel then instructed Hagar as to what to call the child. He would call the child Ishmael. Okay? Um, and then he goes on to describe what Ishmael will be like. Okay? He describes him as a wild donkey of a man. Now, if you think about a donkey, they're usually pretty stubborn. They usually will kick against people that try to control them. They can nip at people. I mean, they're not very nice. They can be not very nice animals. Okay. He goes on to say that that Ishmael will be against everybody else against him, and he would even be against his people of his own household. And so what you're seeing is a quite contrary person who is constantly fighting with others. Now, if you look at today and what's going on with Israel and the Arab nations, you see this playing out, where the Arabs are constantly fighting with each other in the form of Muslims, and they're also fighting against Israel and against the rest of the world. This is exactly what the angel predicted. It's exactly what's happening, that the descendants, spiritual or otherwise, of Ishmael are doing exactly what the angel said would happen. Okay. All right. So after this whole thing, Hagar calls God by a different name. She calls him God who sees me. Now, throughout the Tanakh, you're going to learn where God is represented by many, many different names. Okay, which each one describes an attribute of who he is. So in this one, his attribute is God who sees. Okay, he takes notice. He cares. Okay, it's not just a physical act of seeing Hagar. He took a care to Hagar. He actually came down himself and went ahead and gave instructions to Hagar, prophesied, predicted to Hagar, and then all of this. So, God doesn't just come down to, at any time to just talk to somebody. And so this showed that God cared. He saw Hagar. Hagar mattered to him. Ishmael mattered to him. Her relationship with Sarai mattered to him. He saw all of this, and he cares. All right. So in the last portion of this parashah, we're in chapter 17 now. We go through the circumcision portion. Now, as we talked about, I think in chapter 15, we talked about how God himself passed through the peace of the animals and basically signed the covenant. And basically, in one way, did only his part, but in another way, did both parts. Okay, where he would actually take the place of punishment for what would happen later with Israel breaking the covenant. Okay, however, God did institute this. So, as I point out here, it was sometimes later that God appeared to him. Now, we unfortunately, when we read the Bible, because it's condensed down, and it's not a whole lot between different episodes that take place. We don't go through God appeared to Abraham, and then we go through every single thing that happened, between then and the next time God meets Abraham. We don't do that, and so it seems very condensed. there's the temptation to view all the events of the Bible that they happen in very short order, and it can happen sometimes, but usually there is a good space of time between events. Okay, so when God appears to Abraham, he calls himself El Shaddai. Okay, now what does that mean? So among the Canaanites and among even Abram's ancestors, there were a lot of Els. Okay, there were a lot of gods. All right. However, God distinguishes himself from all his gods as a God who is Shaddai. Okay, and the Shaddai in Hebrew means breast. Now, it just has nothing to do with physical attributes. It has to do with the fact that God nourishes us and his care is sufficient. You can imagine a child being, nourished, like a little child, like a baby, being nourished at his mother's breast or her mother's breast. Okay, this is kind of the same way that God takes care of us. He nurtures us. He takes care of us. And just so you know, to kind of reiterate here, God has both male and female characteristics. Okay, man was originally created as male-female. It wasn't until God took the female portion out of him and made a woman that they were separate. But before that, man was male-female, just like God has male and feminine characteristics. And so that's not blasphemous. That is truth. And so again, God identifies himself to Abram as, I'm the one who nourishes and cares. Well, that must have meant, if he distinguished himself that way, that the rest of the Els, the rest of the gods there, could care less about their people, only care about themselves, were ruthless, required horrible sacrifices. And this was not the way the God of Abraham was or is. Okay, so he distinguishes himself as, I am a God like no others in the world. And there is no other gods in the world. They're all demonic and fallen angels and whatnot. It's all garbage. But God, even with that saying that, God still says, I'm not like those other gods, so-called gods that are out there. This is who I am. And I am the God who loves. I nourish and I take care of. And my nourishment and my care is sufficient. Okay? There's a scripture in the Parashah or the New Testament that says, in him we live, move, and have our being. Okay? And that's exactly what is being said here in this scripture. Okay, so we started, think about this for a minute. It's kind of like a chiasm here. Okay, we started God's heart, or God, this whole parashah, with God relating his heart's desire for Abram. Now we're ending this parashah portion with God again reiterating his heart's desire for Abram. Okay, again, he wants to perform all that he promised for Abraham. He really wants to. That's his heart's desire. He wants to bless Abraham. He wants to love on Abraham. He wants to do good for Abraham. He wants to nourish him. You know, he wants to. So God is the one who initiated this relationship with Abraham. It talks about throughout the word that God initiates the relationship. Then we reciprocate. And when we do that, God wants to pour out his love on us and wants to bless us. And he wants to do these things because he is love and he cares about us. Okay? And so two changes happened to Abram and Sarai. So first, God says, no longer will you be called Abram, which means father of Aram, which means he's a father from Aramites or a father of Aramites. Okay? But instead, you're going to be Abraham, which is father of nations. I'm going to bring many nations. You won't just be father of those of Aram. You will be father of a multitude of nations. Okay? And then Sarai, which means my princess, that I at the end is a possessive portion of Hebrew, is changed to Sarah, which just means princess. Okay, so no longer will she just be Abram's princess. Now she is princess to the world. She is princess or of nations. Nations come out of her. Okay, so their positions have now formally been changed. And you're going to notice throughout the word, or several times, like with Jacob and others, where God changes their name from one name to another. And what that really does is God's changing their position. They're being repositioned from one to another position, to a greater position. Okay? So if you notice, when in both name changes, there is the Hebrew letter He that is added to both names. Now, that Hebrew word, the letter He, is representative of life and vitality. And so by God adding this letter to form their name change, it's like he's breathing life and vitality into both of them, which obviously is going to be needed if they're going to go ahead and have Isaac, but it also speaks of life that's going to come forth from them to go ahead and create multitude of nations. Okay. Now, God conditions his blessing with Abraham and his descendants by proxy on obedience to the covenant. It is always about obedience. Okay. If Abraham or Sarah, or any of the descendants stop obeying, then they've basically cut themselves off from the covenant. Okay? So now we get into the actual Abraham's portion of the covenant, which is circumcision. Okay, the sign that was originally made was God walking through the pieces of animal. Okay? But now Abraham and his descendants and all their households will go ahead and actually have a sign of covenant, which is circumcision. Circumcision is the cutting away of the foreskin of the male organ away, and what that does is twofold. One, it's indicative of cutting the covenant fresh. If you read throughout the Torah, God expects every person to act like they're covenant to covenant with him themselves. Okay? And so every time that cut is made, that person is making that covenant. Now, of course, when you're an 8-day-old child, you don't realize that, but you're taught later about that covenant, how that cut represents that you've cut your portion into that covenant. Okay? It can also be compared to throwing away an ungodly part of someone's heart. I'm throwing away the old part of me, the ungodly part of me, whatever. I'm throwing that away, and wholeheartedly following after God. Okay, now you can also see this. Remember, I told you back that when the whole reason behind the cutting the animals was say, hey, if you break the covenants, what's going to happen to you? Well, that was a pretty big cut, and those animals died because of it. Okay, here we have a little cut, and where yes, it hurts and you bleed, but the person does not die from it. This is prophetic that God will punish, Israel. He will, Israel will feel pain, will bleed, will all these things, but Israel will not be destroyed, even when they break the covenant. Again, because God is taking a position of taking on both his the consequence for him breaking the covenant, which he can't break the covenant, and also the consequences of when the Israel breaks the covenant. Even though they will feel a small cut from that, God will take on the whole entire punishment through Yeshua. And so we see how God's already symbolizing what's going to happen in the future. Now, we read about where Abram is called, will put forth, and Sarah will put forth kings of peoples. Peoples. Well, that's interesting because the kings we focus on in the Tanakh, or in the Tanakh, is the kings of Israel, both the northern and the southern kingdoms. Okay, you don't see anything of kings of other peoples. Now you see with Ishmael. Okay, obviously 12 more and multiple kings come through Ishmael, which actually he came from Abraham. But as far as from both Abraham and Sarah, you don't see that. However, when the exile occurs, when the northern tribes are dispersed, okay, obviously the southern tribes, they have the king comes along the Davidic line. It stays that way. Okay, in the northern tribes though, they are dispersed through all the nations, and so they very well could have become kings of multiple peoples through that exile. And so in that way, that could have been prophetic again of what was going to happen in the future to the descendants of Abraham. All right. So God promises this heir, but Abraham instead still asks, look, can we just let Ishmael be the descendant or my heir instead? But God insists, no, you're not going to have the heir come from Hagar. Okay, it's going to come through Sarai or Sarah. And there's a reason for this. Again, we go back to Egypt was considered the world. Okay, it was considered things that are antithesis to God. Okay, and so God is not going to want the heir to be have been part of Egypt. He wants the heir to come from Abraham and Sarah through the lineage, the righteous lineage that God had ordained. Now, this is not to denigrate Hagar, even or Ishmael specifically, but it is to show that God does not want the heir to have part of his lineage coming from Egypt, their culture, or anything else. Because remember, even though Abraham was probably helping raise this child Ishmael, or may have helped raise him, Hagar was the main one raising Ishmael. Well, Hagar came from Egypt, which means that Ishmael's going to go ahead and learn all of the cultural and other aspects of Egypt. Well, as we learned about earlier, and we learned about later on in Scripture, Egypt is not a good example of morality. Okay, and so because of that, God does not want Ishmael becoming the heir with all that baggage. Okay. Now, It does not mean that God won't bless Ishmael. He will bless Ishmael because of Abraham, and he will even become 12 tribes, just kind of like Israel. But he will not be part of the covenant that God made with Abraham. All right, so the child is to be named Isaac, which means laughter, or it's also a shortened form of God laughs. So there's a reason why he's named this. So first, Abraham laughs to himself and says, am I really going to have have a son, have an heir, and with me, being, this old and Sarai being, in her 90s as well, and so God wants them to name him Isaac to remind them of their slight lack of faith there, and at the end, God's going to have the final laugh. Um, he will have the final laugh when all is said and done. Okay. So again, Abraham does exactly what God tells him to do. And that's a reoccurring theme throughout. Now, you may say, well, what about the incident with Ishmael? Well, in Abraham's eyes, he did do exactly what God told him to do. He embellished on it some, but only because he didn't realize, in his eyes, God never told him that Sarah was the only one who was the main one who had to have the child. So in his eyes, it could have been perfectly legitimate to go ahead and use Hagar instead, because it was not supposed to be told him that Sarai would be the one to actually have Isaac. Okay? And so again, he had all along been doing exactly what God told him to do. All right? So all the males in the household, and that household again included anybody that was part of that family in whatever capacity. If they were male, they were in that family doing whatever, in whatever capacity, they were circumcised. And you're going to see this the same thing that's carried on throughout the Torah, throughout the Tanakh, and even nowadays. Okay, so that is the end of the Parashah portion for this week. I hope you learned a lot and it blessed you. I can't wait to go ahead and go through the next Parashah portion with you this coming Shabbat. So as always, I welcome you to please go ahead and send prayer requests to that email address right there. Please do not share your anything about yourself as far as like any kind of personal identifying factors. First names are fine. You don't have to be real. You don't have to be real specific with what you want in prayer about or what you want other people to have prayer about. But please feel free to go ahead and send a prayer request to that email address right there, and I will definitely pray for you. So until next time, Barachot and Shalom, and I will see you then.